And yes, yeah. First of all, I'd like to emphasize the importance of the topic. The special structure of participation in the Israeli labor force is a very low participation rate of young or prime age male adults. It's the lowest in the world. Secondly, participation of older persons, both men and women, older meaning 55 plus, is higher than in most countries of the world. So the labor market relies very much on older people to supply the labor. And that gets more and more so, not because population is aging, it does not, very slow, but rather because most of the additions to labor force participation in the last 10 or so years comes from women and from older people. Almost no change in participation of prime age males. So very slow. So that is something which should be borne in mind when one thinks of the importance of the issue. Secondly, we have many immigrants, so that cumulated savings towards pensions is somewhat problematic. I'll show some figures. Therefore, work at older ages is very important because most of the people, I'll show it, work more or less, or the average is about 60% of their potential working life, either because they migrate at a later stage or because they don't participate regularly at younger ages. So what happens to the older labor force is particularly important in this country. Now, here are the 60%. And the growing share, because of the rising participation of older people, their share in total employment in this country is growing. Now, if I want to go forward, is this right? This is the percent of actual out of potential working time. It's based on some study we did with the Bank of Israel. And what you see here is that, I'm sorry for the Hebrew, I didn't have the time to translate. So that's 0 to 10 years of schooling. And you see that Arab men and Jewish women use only half their potential time in the in the labor market to actually work. That's based on national insurance. 65 to 70 of males. Look at Arab women. And you see it all. And you see, of course, that the time out of potential seniority in the labor market grows with the level of schooling. So we have two I don't know whether things in the US are similar or not. We have two problems. One is low education people work a small part of their working life, actually, or small or half, so they don't really have the option of saving for occupational pensions. Now, different from the United States, there is no real aging problem. It's very slow, and that's not a burden which we should be concerned about. Secondly, we don't have this connection between health insurance and work, which is one of the things driving towards more participation in the labor force at older ages. That was solved by the national insurance, health insurance, which no Israeli understands the American system. Participation rates. As a matter of from 1999, because I happened to open that book, it could be 1998, to 2010. Look what happens to elderly people. Women. It reads from right to left. I'm sorry. So, in a matter of, 12 years, 11 years, labor force participation of women almost doubled. And you see it at older ages. Here is the break. I mean, after 74, you don't see it, but that is huge. And at a shortly period of time. You have it here with men, less so, but still very impressive. So this is a major driving force in the Israeli economy. Now, I must admit that in 2001 or 2, we wrote with the late Shmuel Amir, we wrote a paper done very carefully in which we proved that the labor force participation of men is declining rapidly. 2 years after that, we were amazed at the reversal. We still are. And we looked at, with some sorrow and some regret, at our previous so nicely written paper, which was totally wrong, and asked ourselves what happened. And one of the things to think of is that this is the reversal of trends, is sharp and characterizes many OECD countries which have different regimes, and the United States has the same reversal. Lots of papers about declining labor force participation in the 1990s. Now everybody is concerned with rising participation. And the reasons are mostly structural. They do not have, I think, I can't be decisive about that, they are not really to be interpreted in terms of the rate of growth of national income and improving labor market conditions, declining unemployment, and so. I don't think that is a major driving force because it happened all over in many countries. So more schooling, better health, planning because of the rising retirement, compulsory retirement age, transition to defined contributions, which have been found to raise the actual retirement by 2 years compared to defined benefits. People who were under the regime of defined benefits were looking at the last best salary and couldn't earn more than that once compulsory retirement comes into effect. So they had no motivation to go on working. With defined contributions, people could save on, and that was a factor. And stronger attachment of women to the labor force. They enter earlier, they stay on later. So all these are reasons for the reversal. Still, the reversal was sharp, and I don't know the explanation for that. It was unexpected, it was sharp. Rising education is a long, protracted process, and that is not explained. It does not explain.
And it was in this age group of 60 to 70 year old? That's where the reversal occurred?
Also 70 to 74.
Okay, but
yeah,
over
mostly 60 to 70. All this is still to say, to stress the importance of the issue. Now, people work for part-time, and there is no change in that trend. So apparently people would like to phase out, not so much in terms of a transitory period until you don't work, but people would like to work less, perhaps for a much longer time. So now, that is not important. I want to ask questions actually about a thing you didn't come to mention, which is Anna Rappaport's suggestion that you could earn pension while still working at the place you were working. This is one of her major recommendations, and I would like to ask your reaction, because I have questions. In the Israeli public sector, there is no possibility of continuing work with the same employer after retirement, and that applies to the universities as well, to the public universities. I cannot...
Not full-time, but part-time, yes.
No. The Hebrew University would not allow a retiree to teach with a financial contract of any kind.
You could teach as an adjunct. You could teach as an adjunct, which is the
Oh yes, I can move to another university.
In the same university.
Oh well, in Jerusalem that doesn't work.
Now it does.
Now it does. Good news. Otherwise, people would have to go to other universities to get a part-time job.
They do.
And that, I think, applies to the civil service at large. If I'm wrong, please correct me. And since about a third of the Israeli labor force, at least, works for the public sector, that sector is closed to that arrangement. Now, there is an implicit tax of going on where you have defined benefits. I, by the way, am asked to pay to the national insurance more or less back what they sent to me as a check of national insurance. So that is contrary to the Pension Protection Act 2006 in the United States, there is no possibility of having a simultaneous work and pension at the same place you were working in before. Now, I have my doubts about that proposal. First of all, if it's on a large scale. The turnover of people who are advanced in age is quite large, and that would involve a lot of fixed costs to maintain a substantial part of your older labor force inside your organization. And the paper you were offering to discuss gave one example which is convincing, which is daycare nurses. There is no fixed cost to speak of. You can send them anywhere, but that would not apply to a lot of other industries where fixed costs are a major concern. Now, another question I have about that is the idea is to retain workers after retirement on a part-time basis and paying them the pension while still working. A lot of instability in earnings because you are in a pool, who knows when you'll be called up. Also, I was once a member of a committee about retirement age, and employers came to us and said that it is extremely difficult in terms of not only labor relations but human relations to take a cohort of 65 or 67 years old people and say, you stay, you are out. After 30 years of service. So they'd rather have a rule and not have to choose among workers. And my last question is about net additions to the total, because if you pay a pension to people while they are working, they will certainly, by any elementary economics, reduce their hours of work. So those who would have worked on full-time without the pension will work less. Some of those who chose before that not to work will work more. I don't know whether it will add in total to the labor force. So,
but it will add to utility. It will add to the welfare of those people. Broadens their choices.
In total, it's iffy, but since it's a choice matter, it will enhance welfare. That's right. So I think that I would like to conclude with the amazing fact that 90% of working people over the age of 60 are extremely happy. 90% say they are very happy or happy, according to social survey. So even though it's a self-selected group, it tells you that I was amazed at the percent.
Is that for Israel or
for Israel? For Israel, the social survey finds 90% satisfaction from work.
You don't believe it.
Or self-chosen workers. One other doubt. Any
traffic, the neighbors, they shoot us. We're thankful.
I think that any kind of arrangement, financial arrangement, which serves as an inducement to continue work, is rather irrelevant to people who do not reach a critical amount of seniority. And that applies also to compulsory occupational pension contribution. A Bank of Israel report from, I think, 2008, Arkanit will correct me, it says that a lot of poor people do not contribute. They evade contribution because it will not make them, they are not taxable, and there is no incentive in that. So making it compulsory is still not making it effective, and we are very concerned about people who work only half of their potential life, do not collect enough savings, and trying to induce them to work at old age is very doubtful, because they are not there anymore since age 50 or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No time for questions. Give you the microphone. We want to start from this end.
Just a few comments or thoughts, both of your talks, which were very, very interesting. I find the idea of part-time retirement or phased retirement very compelling. I think it's a very good idea, and I also think it should be used not only on retirement but also in all kinds of periods through life. But maybe a few comments, maybe and the concern you raised, Ruth, I think that I wish my concern during old age will be my budgetary pension and job security that will enable me to work. Because today most workers do not work with job security nor with budgetary pension, so we won't have these kinds of problems. And I think also all of the discussion of mandatory retirement age must be taking into some kind of limit, that it's relevant only to people who work with job security. I mean, most workers in Israel could be dismissed from any reason at any age. But about the idea of phased retirement or part-time retirement, I think that there are two ways we could achieve this in Israel. One way, and we can do both. One way is to have a right which we have in other countries, a right in Israel to flexible working hours, a right that in the UK or in other countries, the Netherlands, that an employer can request to work part-time, and even if the employer does not have to give him the right, there is some kind of, he has to give some kind of explanation. It can help senior workers, and it could help also workers during their life. This is one way I think we can go. The other way is through the social security system, which today in Israel, if workers, if will reach the age of, it will be 64 and 67 in a few years. So if a worker will reach that age, if a man will reach the age of 67, he does not have incentives to keep working, because he receives, if he will receive the social security benefits, he will stop receiving, if he will continue working, he will not receive the benefits, and only from the age of 70, you get the benefits no matter if you work or you don't work. So maybe it might be also a good idea to make it earlier, that you could receive the benefits at the age of, you could work and receive the benefits at the age of 64 or 67, and you won't, and then you have incentive to keep working and not stop working.
Well, I find myself for the second time in the position of devil's advocate, but speaking about mandatory pension law in Israel, there is some criticism about that, saying that some workers who are making minimum wage are forced to cut their consumption today in order to save for the future, and it's not necessarily increasing their lifetime welfare. So in that sense, I think the American system perhaps has its own advantages.
on the regarding the problem of the mandatory pension savings, and I think given the large proportion of poor workers in Israel, it's really a problem. Now, it was supposed to be introduced together with an earned income tax credit, and if the earned income tax credit would have been introduced at a sufficiently high level, that could actually be a good thing. It has been introduced, but only in some areas, not across Israel. Now it's going to be expanded, but it's very, very small. So it's actually, I think, smaller, the amount that people get, than the additional or the loss of income, and it also applies to a very limited group. So I think it sounds better than it actually is. If you look from a lifetime earning perspective, actually these people, when they retire, will lose the complementary benefits that they would have gotten if their pension would have been lowered. So I think it's a fairly, it's not a decent deal for the poor. Another small comment that I have regarding the table that you showed, and you showed what is the expected rise in the retirement age over the next 40 years, and it is moving more or less together with the life expectancy. The only question that I have, and I guess in some countries it's more acute than in others, whether the starting point is a reasonable retirement age. So even though they move in the together with the life expectancy, I think in some countries at the current retirement age, the starting point is too low, and it is not allowing for sufficient saving for the retirement. So maybe the dynamics is okay, but we're not in. We have to correct the starting point, at least in some countries, including Israel.
Okay. Going on with the comment of Karnit, I was one of the supporters of the mandatory pensions for a long time, but indeed the tax relief that is enjoyed by people who pay income tax is not enjoyed by 50% of the population who do not pay income tax. And I proposed that they should somehow lower the ceiling that from it is 4 or 5 times to 3 or 2.5, so there will be tax gains, and they could be distributed to the people down there as some kind of a tax relief. You don't have to pay tax in order to get a tax relief, and that would go into their pension fund instead of their contribution that the government will contribute, and I think it would be equitable. Of course, the people at the אגף התקציבים, איך נקרא? The budget, at the budget office, said that, well, it's a very good idea to lower the ceiling because then they would have more revenues, but why do we have to combine one with the other? If they get the money, they will get the money, and that's it. So it didn't work out. I want to speak for the young people here who do not somehow speak. And in that sense, I want to be a devil's advocate. I think that there is a risk of the rule of the elderly, kind of gerontocracy, in the idea that people will never retire. And one of the things is that people accumulate, over their lifetime, they accumulate political power within their organizations. So if they don't have to retire, then they can keep on their power forever. And I think that to alleviate this problem, there must be a mandatory retirement age where people have to leave their firm or their institution and they can move to another place. But letting them stay on at the same place, I think is not healthy because, you know, there are some things to say for the young. You know, you talked about Samuelson. I'm sure his mind was as sharp as ever, but he did not redo his 1958 paper on overlapping generation. He didn't. Yes, it was already written, but there is something about young age and innovation. So we should take all of this if we're doing this kind of social engineering, and this is what we are doing. We should take everything into consideration. The old people have more experience, but maybe they cannot innovate. And just to give one final point, at the social protest movement in Israel, it was carried on and led by people who were in the late 20s. They had a different way of looking at society and at problems, which was very innovative. I'm not sure when and how it will be materialized, because there are strong forces who are against it, but they had their own idea to look at society and avoid the usual conflicts and the usual discourse, which was very refreshing and innovative, and which the older people could not come up with. So we have to somehow, you know, make room for the young and combine everything. Thank you.
Just one reaction to Avia's last comment. This is a real or acute problem in the public sector, because the size of the sector is more or less given, and so political power at the higher echelons is a problem. I don't think it is a problem at all in the business sector, because first of all the motivation is earnings and not political power to that degree, and also because new businesses come about and are created and they compete with the older businesses, so that I don't think it should apply to 2/3 of the labor force which is employed in the business sector. There is a tendency which I once lovingly labeled the bath syndrome. You have to take one out of the bath in order to put somebody else in. And this would not apply, I think, to the economy at large, not at all. And that is also the experience of continental European countries, where they were reducing the retirement age in order to give room to younger people. And they ended up with more unemployment and with much less innovation than the American one, which abolished compulsory retirement. So I think there is, in a sense, there is a reason for concern in the public sector, which is more rigid and less expandatory, and less so for most of the other sectors. Thank you.
So let me just give a couple of reactions. First of all, I agree with the point that Lilach made, which is some of the things that Anna Rappaport were talking about really relate to the legacy of defined benefit plans. And really, in the U.S., probably even more rapidly than in Israel, defined benefit plans are part of the legacy. Because Existing plans are being frozen or closed altogether. And the one exception to that, and replaced by defined contribution plans that don't have that problem. The one exception is public sector, state and local employees. But even there, we're going to see, this is a prediction, it hasn't yet happened in many states, but they are going to transition to defined contribution plans as well, largely because the cost accounting techniques that they have used in the past have understated the cost of these defined benefit plans. And now, as larger numbers of employees are actually retiring, the cash flows are draining the budgets. So we have already seen a couple of major cities declare bankruptcy because of pension costs. And b'diavad, ex post, reducing benefits. San Diego is the most prominent example recently. And in Rhode Island, the state has actually already passed legislation converting any new entrants to defined contribution plans. So I think that issue has been pretty much settled. The issue of that Avia raises is a real issue. Experience versus fresh ideas. There are lots of examples we can think of. From my youth, I remember Bertrand Russell in his 90s leading the peace movement and ban the bomb and all this sort of stuff. So it's not necessarily the case that the elderly, are standing in the way of progress. In some ways, they are free to do whatever they want because, they take the attitude, so what are they going to do to me? Throw me in jail, at age 90?
You and I are exceptional.
Ah, of course, that's it. That was my point, but I didn't want to be that direct about it. My ideal is you reach a certain age, maybe it's 65 or so, where you go half-time. It's the same idea, half-time or three-quarters time. And I definitely see this happening in the academic world, where professors don't retire, they just go to half-time. They teach half as many classes, but they retain their whole social community, which is really the most important thing to them. It's often not so much the money that they want, it's the activity and the social connectivity. So that's my attitude towards this issue. And I think if we had much more flexible work hours at every stage in the life cycle, we would see more people just, retirement would become history. Or as one of my friends said, the new retirement is work.